Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and tonight I welcome back Glenn Cheney, who was on the show, I think about 10 years ago, after he had written a book about his walking along the Estrada Real in Brazil, and he's written a lot of books since then. So we're going to talk about some of them. So welcome, Glenn.
Well, it's good to be back.
And I guess I wanted to start and just ask you, like, how you decide what to write about.
Oh, well, I don't know. I guess it has to meet three criteria. It has to be interesting to me, because if it's not, I'm never going to be able to spend. Sometimes some of these books take 10 years to write, and I can't really pay attention to anything for more than 4 or 5 minutes if it isn't really interesting. And it's got to be something that no one else has written about, or, why bother? And it's got to be something that's, good for the world, something the world needs, a book that serves some good, I guess.
Well, I'm glad you're on the show, because that's sort of like our criteria for guests on the show, although the interest doesn't have to hold us for, 10 years,
Right.
but
An hour will do.
But something that's interesting that is not, generally being covered in mainstream media, and also that people can come away with it thinking about ways they can get involved that will be helpful for themselves and for the world. So one of the books you wrote recently is called Law of the Jungle, Environmental Anarchy and the Tenuring People of Amazonia. And I guess maybe you can start by pointing on the map. Where is Amazonia?
Well, Amazonia is the entire region that is drained by the Amazon River. So it's a vast area. I mean, it's almost as big as the continental United States or east of the Rockies. It's a huge area.
So it would be like in the north area of South America.
Yeah. Not a good map to show where it all is, but
country. I'm guessing that very green part of the
there you go.
is more or less where it is.
Let me here. Maybe I can point. Yes, here's the Amazon right here, right? And there's a very, very long river called the Madeira that flows in just south or just downstream from Manaus, which is over here, but it flows down out of Bolivia. And maybe 600 or 700 miles up this river, there's a town called Humaitá. And nearby there's an Indian, I guess not exactly a reservation, but it's land that the Indians have been, in some people's words, have been given to them, which really means has not been taken away from them.
Yet,
and that's exactly what this book is about, in that the forest all around this, I mean, the Amazon is not what you picture with the massive trees and the vines and the snakes hanging down and the monkeys. Most of the Amazon now, if it isn't a preserved park, it's soy fields or cattle. You can go. I was in another region to write a different book, and I roamed around 300 or 400 miles. I never saw a forest. It's just all cattle land and
now it was forest at one time, but has been deforested over the past century? Or?
Century? No, since about 1974.
Oh, so really just the last 40 years.
Yeah. I was, we're getting way off track here, but that's all right.
We have time.
Let me get off track here. Do we have the book about the nun here?
Yeah.
This book called Promised Land, which is about a nun in the state of Mato Grosso, which is part of Amazonia. And I happened to meet a family there that was among the first, as they call themselves, pioneers who arrived there in 1974, I think it was. Coincidentally, the same year that I first went to Brazil, just by chance. But this family had moved up from the south, and they got off the bus and they were supposed to have houses built for them, and everything was going to be ready for them to begin to settle. And they got there, and they got off the bus, and it was a jungle. It was a jungle. This woman that I met there, this family, she was a grandmother at the age of 34. Had remembered then when she was like 4 years old or something, they spent the first few nights in a little plastic tent, and they could hear these jungle animals outside, and They had to start from scratch. There was nothing there. I mean, they really, really struggled, and now and when, I was there in 2010, and the jungle was gone. The forest was gone. It was all cattle pasture.
So they were really part of a wave of settlers?
They were part of a wave. They were like the first ones there, and it was below freezing when they left the south of Brazil, and they got off, and it was 110 degrees, and that hot house of the Amazon. And over the next years, in their struggle to survive, they and everybody else just cut down every tree, burned them all off, and now all of a sudden, what do you know? But the springs are drying up, the rivers are drying up. People are just moving off their farms because it's becoming unviable. You can't grow anything there anymore. The soil's very poor and there's no water, and so even her father now says he's sorry about what happened there. They didn't know that was going to happen. They were told you have to clear from around the water, the springs and rivers, so that the water doesn't get sucked up by the trees. Well, it turns out that's what causes them to go dry. Now they know. Now it's too late. Now you can't even plant this stuff back.
Wow.
So she realizes this, but she also realizes that people live there. They have to earn a living there. Are they supposed to just go back to the city and live in a slum or something? So there's this question of, they're there, the forest is gone, things are falling apart, what do you do? So they have a plan to try to reforest, at least get some shade over the land, because the land's just baking and, drying up. So they're trying to plant harvestable forest, where, not cutting down forest to do it, but where there's pasture, they're trying to plant trees, balsa and such. So that's the situation in general. The jungle is largely gone, and the main culprit, this is going to come back to the Tenerian Indians here, the main culprit was this trans-Amazonic highway that they built during the military dictatorship that began in like 1964, I think. And they decided to build a highway from the eastern part of Brazil over to the western, right through the Amazon, under the theory of, what did they call it? We would call it use it or lose it. They were afraid some other country would come in and invade because it was just unpopulated by anybody but these, these Indians who, weren't considered exactly Brazilians. They were just people living out in the woods. So they put in this highway, and it happened to go through this, what later became the town of Humaitá, which is near where the Tenerian people have their reservation. Their reservation, if we can call it that, they don't call it that. They just call it their, indigenous land. But it's about 1 million acres, which seems like a lot. Right now, there's only about 1,000 people there. It used to be 10,000. After this highway came through, the 10,000 population was reduced to about 200.
Okay, what happened?
It was just outright murder. They just enslaved these people to build the highway, work that white people couldn't do. They, walking around in
So
swamp
in some
mud.
ways, not that different from the building of the railroad across the United States.
Very much the same. Very much the same. And they would just take the Indian women for their own purposes and work people to death and feed them nothing, pay them nothing, certainly. And disease was the major culprit, but basically just about everybody died. They were given this land, 1 million acres, which sounds like a lot, but there are people in Brazil, individuals, and there are some names in the book, in this book, of people who own, individuals who own a few million acres, which they don't actually own it, they never bought it. All of this land that's been turned into pasture and stuff, it's simply people who went there and said, okay, we're going to burn off this forest and put our cows here. They don't own it, they never bought it, because there's very little law. That's why we call the book Law of the Jungle. There's very little law there. They would just have the local government issue them some deeds, which would give them a dubious, illegal claim to it.
And my guess is they had the holdings, so they had the money, so they could defend it.
Yeah, they would have more money than anybody else, and the government's, rather corrupted, to say the least. And so they would people would take 50,000, 100,000 acres, and some have millions of acres for one individual or one family. So when you talk about these Indians of 1,000 people, who used to be 10,000, having 1 million acres, it isn't that much.
And Brazil is a big place.
It's a big place. The Amazon is a big place, and there still is forest. It's, it's where it's inaccessible. So wherever this road went, that was the end of the forest there. I've been down this road, and you can go for days and not see a forest, barely see a tree.
Now, how long is that road?
Oh, I don't know. I would guess it's 1,500 miles, something like that. I don't really know. I'm just guessing.
It's really always shocking to me looking at a map and seeing how big Brazil is.
Yeah, you look at Brazil and you think, this little something that's that long, and you realize that that's days of journeying.
So now there still are a few of the indigenous people living in the area. What are they doing? How are they surviving?
They basically survive off their land, off their forest. And this is a really, really significant point. They need to have that forest intact because they can live off it. The animals, they can hunt for animals, they can use, small amounts of wood. They don't just cut it all down. They use branches and the occasional tree, and they have patches of what they call black earth, which over the millennia, they have gradually taken the very, very poor soil of the Amazon and with organic material built it into really rich pockets where they can plant things. They can live off the forest indefinitely, as they have for millennia. Around the forest, around their piece of land, all the forest has been cut down. It's all gone. Capitalism. I talked to a nun there, and she would refer to this as capitalism, but it's, I guess it is capitalism. People who want to come in. I mean, a forest is not worth anything. If you don't have a family living there that can use the nuts and pick the fruit and, use the different materials there, the only way to get the wealth out of a forest is to cut it down. You get a great amount of wealth in a very short period of time. The owners of these companies that cut these down, they live in Sao Paulo. They need a lot of money to support their penthouses or whatever. But they need to cut the forest down in order to get enough profit out of it to serve their purposes. Obviously, that can't go on forever. And they've now reached the point where what's left is this Indian land that still has forest on it. So these logging companies just go in there and cut down the trees. And there's no law. You call the police, there are no police. The police are literally 500 miles away, and they're not especially eager to go out there and do anything about it. And then the rare occasions when they do come in, they do a little something, and then they leave, and boom, the loggers come back. So these Indians have this conflict with the local loggers. All right, so when was it? End of 2013, December, around Christmas time, there was what sparked this riot? Oh yeah, all right, this is where the book starts off. Where did it start off? Their chief, named Ivan, was very, very vociferous and active and activist in trying to stop this logging that was just, they need this forest. They can't just be cutting it down. That's the capitalist way. Their way is sustainable. It's an alternative economy that works.
And without the trees, it won't sustain.
Without the trees, there's just nothing. They can't do it. And it works. You can't live a very wealthy life, but you can have a decent life. So he was trying to protect this land, which under the Constitution that was, passed or established in 1988, they were given this land. It's their land. It was established in the Constitution. Well, one day they found him dead on the side of the road, almost dead. He was on his motorcycle coming back from a certain kind of a Wild West village that just it was described to me as the place where all the criminals go. And a lot of logging camps there and no law whatsoever. And he had gone there to do some shopping or something and was coming home on his motorcycle and apparently got hit and was lying there next to the motorcycle, almost dead. They took him to the hospital, but he died. So, of course, the Indians were pretty sure he was killed. His wife says, no, he probably just fell off the motorcycle. I don't know, that's what she said. Well, a few days later, a couple weeks later, a car with 3 white guys coming out of Humaitá going to this other place, which is called 180, kilometer 180. And they were passing on the Trans-Amazonic Highway that goes right through the reservation, or right alongside it, and they disappeared. Oh, wait, back up. The Indians decided, because their forest was being torn down, and because they couldn't sustain themselves with the forest being torn down, and they were actually prohibited by law from cutting down the forest themselves in order to, have big planting, which is a reasonable thing, give this big piece of forest, but you got to leave it forested. They put up what they call a compensation booth, a toll booth. It isn't really clear whether that was legal or not, but if there's no law, everything's legal, right? So they put up a toll booth, and people would come along in their cars or trucks, and it was easier to just pay the damn toll, which might be somewhere from $7 to maybe 30 or 40. Pay it rather than get in a fight with the Indians out there in the middle of the jungle. And this went on for a long time, but people were getting kind of mad about it and saying, well, why, we give these Indians, we give them all this land, and now they want to milk us for money too, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one reason maybe why the Indian chief got bumped off his motorcycle. Well, a few weeks after he got bumped off his motorcycle, these three white guys in a car went through this toll booth, and a little later they just disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. A few days later, everybody's just sure the Indians killed them, even though this was not very many miles from this lawless encampment where everybody's a criminal. There's a gun traffic coming out of Bolivia and drugs and these illegal logging camps, and it wasn't too very far from there. And there are bandits in Brazil. There are real, honest-to-God bandits, and especially along that stretch of the highway. These guys disappeared. Everybody in Humaitá immediately assumes the Indians killed them to get back revenge for the chief. Turns out that of the three, two of them were friends of the Indians. They had played soccer with them. They went there and sold them products for the little store that they have in their village and everything. And it was just unthinkable that these Indians would pick these three particular guys and just kill them. But these guys disappeared, and then there was a riot in Humaitá. And the people in Humaitá, it was stirred up by certain local, conservative anti-Indian type people, anti-indigenous. And there was a riot, and the Indian health clinic there in town got burned down, and several vehicles got burned down, and a boat that would deliver supplies to indigenous peoples going up these little rivers, that got burned up, and I don't remember exactly, but there was quite a bit of damage, and all the Indians had to run away, and they were put on this little army compound for a few days, and then they were taken, this is all right on Christmas Eve, right? And they were finally, were taken back to their village. The highway was shut down. Nobody could go across the river to get to the village, and everything was kind of very, very tense. And then they found, did they find the car? No, they did not find the car, but they found the bodies on the Indian reservation, which doesn't prove anything, but that's where they were, so people are now absolutely sure. So the police came in and arrested 5 Indians. It just so happens they arrested basically the chief, the acting chief, who was the son of the chief who got killed, and his brother, and they were basically the leaders, the cultural and political leaders of the Indians. They just picked them, no particular reason, except that they were the leaders. They're basically, the feeling is, among the Indians, they're trying to just assassinate the culture, because if you can get rid of the Indian culture, then they aren't Indians anymore, and then they don't have a right to land if they're just a bunch of regular people, not Indians, who aren't speaking their own language, and then you can go in and take all their trees. That's what the Cheney believe.
A million acres worth.
A million acres worth of trees, which will last them for another year or two, and then it's gone, and then what? Well, nobody's really thought about that. They don't see where this whole capitalism thing is going. I talked to a very, very interesting nun there who works for an organization that protects Indian rights, and they are by no means trying to convert the Indians to Catholicism or Christianity, not at all. They respect the Indian beliefs, and they're just trying to help these poor people who are kind of defenseless. They don't have any money, they don't speak the language, and there's no law anyway, and it's, anyway, she said that, the main reason we have to defend these people is because they have an alternative economy. And capitalism can't let that economy be. It's a conflict. You can't have a sustainable economy and this economy that is based on destruction.
Because the growth that's necessary to sustain capitalism can't be done sustainably.
That is basically true. You can't have You can't get rich just using a forest for what it has, and we have no way of valuing oxygen or the protection of water. That doesn't come into the bottom line. We don't know how to count that.
But you know, if we look into our future,
Don't. No,
sorry, but yeah, we do need some paths forward. I mean, if we want any kind of soft landing, these are alternatives that we should be looking at, because, you know, we could perhaps become more sustainable ourselves.
Yeah, we're going to have to be. If the Amazon is any kind of illustration of what's happening, we're going to run out of, resources.
It's already pretty clear that the soil is poor. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, there are a lot of, because of climate change, chopping down a lot more trees does not seem like a wise idea.
No, it doesn't. This all fits together in such a beautiful, ugly way, but back in the 1970s, not professor, but a scientist named Fearnside, whom I actually managed to talk to in Manaus, back in the 70s, he was saying, if you cut down all the Amazon, which was just beginning then, if all those trees disappear because of they have these, what do they call it, rivers of the sky, I think, the water that these trees suck up and transpire into the atmosphere, there's an actual river of humidity that flows south, and when it gets down to southern Brazil, it meets the cold air coming up from Argentina and produces rain. Well, now enough trees are gone that Sao Paulo is in a drought that's even worse than California's, or at least as bad. And then California is another river. Apparently that's also being caused by the same Amazonian destruction. When was it? The rainy season in the south of Brazil is October to March. At the end of February, this is coming up to the end of the rainy season, the reservoirs for Sao Paulo were down to 5% of capacity.
Wow.
And they had to go through till October without any more rain. They happen to have quite a bit of rain in March, but right now they're at like 15% capacity. Slightly more than they were a year before, but not much. I can't imagine the disaster of, Sao Paulo's a big city. There's like the greater Sao Paulo must have 15 million people. And the whole industrial economic heart of Brazil is down there. Rio's having the same problems, and that whole region down there. I can't imagine what you do with a city of 10 million people if there's no water. You can't just produce it. You can't just, where's it going to come from? What are they going to do with that city? I started to write a book about this, started to research it, but then the rains came back, and I thought, well, maybe it won't be such a problem. I thought that by August, September of this year, they were going to have to abandon Sao Paulo. They haven't had to do that, but the problem isn't getting much better, and apparently it's because of the destruction of the Amazon. The government is doing nothing to stop the devastation of the Amazon. In fact, to the contrary, there's a political caucus called ruralistas, people who just believe that the rural areas are there to be exploited, that they're there to be planted, build the dams, build the highways, screw the Indians and screw the forest. We're going to, this is wealth that they want to produce down there. And they're controlling the government to a great extent. There's now bills in Congress there to change the Constitution, amend the Constitution in order to do away with these rights that these Indians were given, to be able to have mines on their land without their permission. Just go in there because the wealth is there, go in there and take it. They are building right now, I think the plan is like 30 or nearly 30 what they call major dams in the Amazon, plus more than 100 smaller dams. All of those rivers, the Madeira, I don't know about the Madeira, they have 2 dams there, but I don't think they're going to build more there. But other rivers, they're going to flood out. These Indians live along rivers, they're all going to be flooded out, and there are certain legal processes that you have to go through, and they just ignore them. their equivalent of the EPA says you can't build a dam there. One, it's not going to pay off. Two, it's going to have environmental devastation, and this is all very complicated on how to explain why, but and you're going to have all these hundreds of thousands of indigenous people who are just going to have to go somewhere, so you can't do it. But they do it anyway. They just do it anyway. They just ignore the law and proceed and do what they want to do.
And I'm wondering if there's somewhere that people end up going are the big cities like
Sure.
Rio and Sao Paulo, which are maybe reaching or past their capacity already.
Oh, yeah, they have these massive slums, the favelas, and these are people coming out of the forest, and they don't know how to earn a living in a city. They know how to catch fish and take care of themselves in the forest, but they don't know what to do in a city. They're just going to exacerbate that problem there. And of course, there's no way to figure out the economic impact of having all these people move down to the city, and these dams, or many of them, are just not economically viable. They do not reduce consumption, or the production of carbon dioxide. They actually increase it because they increase the production of methane because of the stagnant water and because of the carbon trading cap and trade deal. If European companies invest in a dam, even though that dam is going to produce more carbon dioxide than the power plants it supposedly replaces because of the cap and trade thing, they can emit more carbon dioxide in Europe. So it's like a double whammy of destruction there.
Okay, now, is there a way forward that would make sense?
Yeah, and the Pope knows the way.
Okay, we'll get to the next book, because I thought it was an unusual topic for you to be writing about the Pope, even though you have written about nuns who go to faraway places and do amazing things. But the book, Be Revolutionary, Thoughts from Pope Francis, seems a little different.
It is different, and what attracted me to it was the issues, and I got this idea shortly after coming back from the Amazon with everything that I learned about this. To back up a bit about the hopelessness, the way forward, I asked this Dr. Fearnside, is this hopeless? I mean, all this evidence of just everything going wrong. And he said, well, it's only hopeless if we give up. Doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
He's got the solutions. I mean, he does these incredible list of academic papers that this guy has published. But anyway,
there still are solutions. We just need to get the will to.
Yeah, you need the political will to make it happen, and well, let's call it the moral will. So I came back with all these, a new understanding of all the issues that were involved here, and I started reading different things that the Pope has either written or said in speeches or press conferences, and he's touching on all these different issues that all kind of link in together, and it's a solution. I don't know if it's one that's going to happen. I mean, to just say, okay, first thing we're going to do is do away with greed. Okay, good luck with that. But that's what we have to do. I mean, just to say, well, that can't be done, that's the equivalent of saying, well, nothing can be done. So I just started looking at all the different things that he's written about, and so this book is each little thought, if you will, is just a paragraph or two, and the thoughts are on just an amazing variety of things. One thought is on the worship of money, on grassroots organizations, on social activists, on altruism and hypocrisy, on value of workers, on the discarding of people, on the cost of consumerism, on people as leftovers, on trickle-down economics, on the wealth gap, on ethics, on the social function of property, on irksome discourse. I like that. Embracing Muslims.
So what's irksome discourse?
Well, you'll have to buy the book to find that out. But it's people, who talk like that. On the causes of slavery, on the seeking of truth, on hidden slavery, on Islamophobia, on Christianophobia, fear of Christians, on his prayer in a mosque, on the stewardship of nature, on torture, on all these different topics. And they all fit together into this wonderful morality that is necessary and yet impossible, which does not portend well if something's necessary and impossible.
I have to say, though, in my memory, I don't think has ever been a pope in my lifetime that people are paying attention to, not just observant Catholics, but like all of us are kind of watching and listening to what he's saying because it's surprisingly relevant. And I grew up in a Jewish household that was not very, sympathetic towards Catholicism, and here's this Pope that makes sense.
Yeah, right. I'm not a Catholic. I have never been, nor am not likely to ever be, although it's beginning to look a little bit attractive here. I mean, I have not studied papal encyclicals and positions over the years by any means, not until recently, but this one just touches on everything, and it all fits together very well. The most famous thing to come along is his encyclical, Laudato Si, that came out, was it this week or last week? Last week, I guess, Thursday of last week. And it's on, what does he call it, on the care of our common home, basically talking about the earth and the environment, but he links, it's just ingenious how he links all of these things together. Everything from slavery to the wealth gap to materialism to the consumer society to superficial culture to... It all just kind of fits in together with the environment. Not that that's necessarily the central thing, but it's just a big piece of this massive moral puzzle where everything just fits together.
Well, the environment is a big piece of it because even if we start treating other humans all well, if we don't, steward the land better than we have, we could all end up either drowning or desiccating, depending on where we live.
Yeah.
And, but even if we become nice people, we're still at risk if we don't take care of the earth as well.
Exactly. And taking care of each other, treating people with, with love, with goodwill. If we do that, we'll be taking care of the environment too. We won't be cutting down the forest of indigenous people just because they're running around without shirts on out in the woods. That doesn't give us the right to go in there and just say, okay, you are being disposed of, we need your trees.
But then we look at the U.S. history and the indigenous people, and I don't know if your next book could be about like uranium mining in the Midwest United States and its impact on indigenous people here. But,
going back to day one, I mean, from Columbus to the Cherokees and the Trail of Tears, and what people say when they read this book is haven't they learned anything? This is the 19th century all over again. It's still happening. They haven't learned.
No.
We know it, but they don't know it.
And yet we're not really totally, here we're not, in this country, we also may know it all as people, but I think one of the issues, and I think the Pope does talk a little bit about it too, is like corporate decision-making, is not really the same as human decision-making. And, it isn't even a personal greed. It's, the profit motive that can be very destructive because it doesn't have a long-term view.
Yeah, it doesn't look at the people on the downside of the profit, on the people who have, negatively affected by it.
And I always wonder about it, as I get older, and like people who are making these decisions, most of them have kids, they have grandkids. It's like, aren't they thinking about what the world is going to look like in 50 years or 70 years?
They may be in denial, or they might just think, how many people in this country just think that there isn't any problem? The global warming isn't happening. Evolution never happened either. This is, there's a great deal of ignorance out there, and a great deal of denial, and who cares what happens to the world? If at least I can get my kids through college, then, they'll be able to solve these problems, and mankind has always solved its problems before. It will continue to do so in the future, and maybe it will. I don't know.
Well, I hope so.
At awful cost, yeah.
Well, not that long ago, the Pope was in the news because he said we have to do something about climate change in the world. And it really started up a huge firestorm in this country. I don't know if it did in other places where, he was admonished by some American right-wingers to leave science to the scientists.
Right.
Then turned out he is one.
Yeah, right, and they aren't, or the Onion article, right, that said, what was it, they leave science to the people who are denying that there's climate change.
Something like. So, let's see this. So I don't know, do you think that the Pope's bully pulpit around the world is going to change people's hearts and minds?
It's got to have some impact. I don't really know. It's hard to say, but I'm sure there will be corporate resistance. And when you got corporate resistance, that's a mighty big thing to resist. But it'll probably have more impact outside the United States, I would guess, but I don't really know. It'll have the most impact among the poor, but they don't have any power, don't have any money. They can't make things change. If you want to change things, you got to change the corporations. They're the ones running the show now, in case you haven't figured that one out.
Yeah.
My personal opinion.
And there's a huge movement in this country to change that, but it's really hard. Where our
really
political system makes it very difficult for people to have their voices heard over the clanging of the change. But I noticed that once again there's a huge outcry to change the Citizens United ruling, which would help. At least corporations wouldn't be able to, use money as speech.
Yeah.
Now, back to Brazil, and a lot of your books have been about Brazil. You've lived there for several years, right?
That's right. I've lived there since 1974. I lived there 3 different times, so I kind of know the language. I haven't lived there a long time, but 3 different times, maybe 5 or 6 years in all.
Now, this book, which I know very little about, but is also quite new, and I can't even read the title, but or the main title, but Brazil's Lost Nation of Fugitive Slaves, sounds intriguing. So the Law of the Jungle is about the indigenous people living there. Who is this about?
This is about this Quilombo dos Palmares. A Quilombo is a maroon, what we in English call a maroon community. It's and there were thousands of these all over Brazil. Places where slaves would go off into the woods somewhere and hide and try to lead a life of freedom. This one, the Quilombo dos Palmares in northeast Brazil, was thriving through the entire 17th century. The first reports of the place were 1603, I think, and it was there until 1694. It was at almost constant war with the biggest empires on earth. It's not clear how many people there were, but somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people.
Wow.
Which is a big community in 1640, 1650. They had several cities up in the mountains, or not very far inland, maybe 50 miles inland. And this was when Brazil was first being settled, and it was just being used to plant sugarcane, and which needed a lot of manpower brought in from Africa. They had a semi-parliamentary government. Women were considered equals with men. It was very egalitarian. There were a few, handful of leaders at the top who were a little bit better off, but everybody else was equal. Everybody worked. Nobody really owned land, but they were given pieces of land that they could farm. They had a strong iron production, blacksmiths at the time. This surprised me.
Oh, wow.
African iron technology was more advanced than European at that time. How about that?
So in spite of what we've been led to believe.
Whatever you might have been led to believe, they were, in fact, that when the slave hunters would go there, they would look for the people who knew iron technology. There was a god of iron, I think, who was also the god of war, and he had to be appeased lest he take away this technology of iron. So many of these fugitives knew how to, blacksmithery, if that's the word. No, it's not, but...
Everyone knows what you mean.
Yeah, they knew how to work with iron. And so they had a system of taxation, and their probably second and their last king, this is really interesting, his name was Zumbi. That wasn't his born name. He was born in Palmares. A Portuguese incursion, they would send up every few years, they would send up another bunch of men to try to wipe out these slaves, and they always failed. They couldn't find them. They captured a baby and brought him back like a little pet, like a little pet raccoon or something, and they gave it to a priest, or they gave it to a rich guy who didn't want the kid, I guess, and he gave it to a priest, and this priest raised him and educated him, and he became very well educated. He knew Latin. He was considered one of the smartest young men in town. And at the age of 15, one day he just got up and disappeared. And he went back to Palmares and became, at first, their minister of defense, their not god of war, but their war guy. And the place became much more aggressive and much more stronger. The fortifications were better, and he then became there was a certain schism with the former king who appeased the Portuguese and agreed to move on to basically a reservation, and some people said, no, we can't do that, we won't be free, and Zumbi stayed in the mountains, and then that king got killed, and there was a little rebellion, and then Zumbi was the king of this place. And he built this massive fortress on top of a mountain, almost impenetrable. It was a whole city, a citadel up on top of this mountain.
Almost like a medieval city.
Exactly, with 3 walls around it. So that anybody who attacked had to break through one wall, which would put them between, right up against the next wall where they would be sitting ducks. And even if they got through that one, there was another wall. And it was there for a long time. And finally, 3,000 men went up there. And just because they were there for a month trying to break through this, they were losing. They were actually being fought off, but they finally found a way. They broke through, a sentry fell asleep, and they were able to get in, and they wiped that civilization off the face of the earth. There is not one...
So there are no descendants?
Well, there are descendants, but you don't know who. I mean, they didn't have birth certificates or anything. Right. But some people survived. Most of them were killed. There's no artifacts. There's not one written word from out of that place. There are no arrowheads, no pottery, nothing that is identifiably Palmarian remains.
So part of the goal of the people breaking in was to just make the culture disappear.
Oh yeah, they wanted to do it. This place was considered a threat to the Portuguese Empire because it was becoming so big and so strong. It was raiding the coast. It would burn down plantations and take the silver and gunpowder and weapons and iron and stuff, and free the slaves. And if they were actually threatening to push Portugal out of Brazil, which would be effectively, hurt their empire so much, and they were the major defender of the Catholic Church. So if these people succeeded in doing away with the Portuguese and getting them out of Brazil, they would end up actually making Catholicism fall. It was that serious. The Portuguese, plus the standard of living of these people up in the mountains was higher than the standard of living on the coast, where people were, well, first of all, most people were slaves, but even those who were not slaves were just living in mud. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible, feudalistic society, and the people up in the mountains, I mean, they weren't rich by any means, but they had enough to eat. They had a variety of food. The people on the coast had an economy. They weren't planting any food. They lived off sugarcane. I mean, they would use the sugarcane to bring in food from Portugal, but these people up in the mountains, the Palmarians, were proving that you could have, a society could thrive without slaves. They couldn't let that stand. They had to wipe them out, and they finally did.
So what year did Portugal actually leave Brazil? Or about when was it?
It's complicated. They didn't leave all of a sudden, and I don't know the exact year, but they were there. It was considered part, all right, so in 1809, I think, or 14, Napoleon invaded Portugal, and he was getting close to Lisbon, and the entire monarchy, royal family of Portugal got into 3,000 ships, and they moved their empire to Brazil.
Oh,
First to Salvador and then into Rio de Janeiro. And that was the center, that was the seat of the government of Portugal until, I don't remember the years here exactly, but until roughly 1825, it was safe to go back, but they left the son of the former empire there to take care of Brazil. And then there was a Portuguese, some political crisis back in Lisbon, and they called that guy back. And so on the way to the port, he got, as the story goes, he got diarrhea or some kind of, Zumbi's revenge. And he basically, his PR people said he's something like, liberty or death, we are now an independent nation.
well, we have
But it
about,
was more like, you can imagine what he said.
right. Well, we only have about 2 minutes left, but I have one more quick question.
All right.
Was there ever any interaction between these Palmarians and the indigenous people?
Yes, well, that's why we can't really identify any artifacts up on top of this mountain. I mean, in these cities, it was blacks, the former slaves, and Indians living there, and there were white people who were, judged criminals on the coast, and that could be anything from prostitutes to people who spoke rebellious words or criminals, or they would flee and go up there where they
Some
were
of them
welcome.
got assimilated in.
They got assimilated in, so you had all of these, and they were all, of course, mixing and breeding, and the Palmarian technologies of, say, ceramics and such, they just adopted the Indian, so it's really hard to tell what ceramics, shards of pottery are from Palmarians or just from Indians who had lived there from before or after Palmares. So yes, they got along with the indigenous people, and everything was just hunky-dory. There were Muslims there. There were probably Jews, because for a while the Dutch settled that area, and they brought in Jews because they were good at business. And then the Portuguese came back. This was during the Inquisition. They didn't get along with the Jews, so the Jews, where do you think they went? New York. They went to New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam was basically founded by Brazilians.
Oh, wow.
Brazilian, Dutch Jews who went up there, but some of them didn't. We think, theoretically, some of them went up into the mountains and lived in this place.
I never would have thought there was that kind of connection.
Small world.
Well, thank you, Glenn. If anyone wants to check out the books, they do transport you to a different place, a lot of them to various spots in Brazil, but not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
And you can find out more at cheneybooks.com. So thanks again, and we did need all the time we had.
We did. Well, looking at a different clock, I thought we had 20 more minutes.
So next week is going to be our last show before we go on summer vacation, and the guest will be Cindy Barry, who's bringing a farmer or two to talk about the New London Field of Greens Farmers Markets. So we'll see you then, and I'll see you too, Glenn. I'm not quite sure where, but
I'll be around.
you'll be around.
Oh yeah, I like this. I was raised down at Fort Trumbull, warm friends and family around me. What's now a blighted neighborhood, overlooking a river to the sea. Soon all that'll be left of it will be nothing but them good old memories. Them parking lots, having an hell decent Christmas. Settle me at your house, not mine.